Happy to see you all, you darlings. Happy to see you all. Everybody. Christopher, Naina, Beth, Jane, John. Hi, guys. Barbara, Janice, everybody. Good to see you, people. Okay. Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Anna. So, darlings, what shall we talk about on our little hour, our 60 minutes, our precious little minutes? Think about the meaning of life. Think about how to change our body, speech, and mind. So we can become better human beings, so we can be a benefit to others. That's the plan. So, someone has something. Good. Talk to me. Aaron and David and Muriel. Hello.
Hello.
What would you like to say?
And Robina, really nice to see you again.
Good. Yes.
My mom and I and Aaron were talking a little bit about mind training, and I feel like you would be a little bit more skillful in explaining it than I would be. So would you maybe spend some time talking about the value and what it is for us?
So when you say mind training, David, do you mean the kind of the technical term Lojong, which refers to the Bodhisattva path, or do you mean in general the approach of being a Buddhist of working on your mind?
The latter, in general, just being able to control our reactions. And
okay, perfect. Okay,
Can you turn it up?
all right. Huh?
No, that's as loud as it gets.
Okay, good. Okay, so this is the essence of it. So this is the essence of being a Buddhist, really. So, okay, so then really, as I like to put it, the mind is Buddha's expertise. This is really a good way to put it. And this is, I always say this, and it's true, and it's good to remember it, that it's really a surprise to us to think that. Because as soon as we think spiritual, we immediately think of a soul or a spirit or some other word, don't we? We never would say, ever, we would never say psychology or even mind when we mean spiritual. And I suppose that's because when we generally mean spiritual, we usually mean religious. And then we have the world religions, which are creator religions. And there they all talk about, whether it's the Hindus, the Muslims, the Jews, the Christians, they talk about this component of a person given to us by the creator called a soul or a spirit, you know, or the Hindus would call it an Atman, a self. So this is sort of an assumption. I think we have quite a real assumption, an unquestioned assumption that that's spiritual. So then we hear that Buddha talks about a mind. So then we of course immediately visualize a brain. We think, well, that's a bit peculiar because we didn't really start studying the brain until recently, you know. So no, this is not this is the thing. Buddha's word mind actually is used synonymously with the word consciousness. So already that changes something, because again, in the world, when we say mind, we mean simply the brain. But even if we say the word consciousness, that has a sort of a slightly nicer, a sort of a deeper flavor, you know, a bit more than merely mind, but maybe slightly different from spirit. So it's sort of something more, you know, maybe unique to humans. But the Buddhist approach is very clear. He talks about we have a body, and then we have a mind. So the word mind in Buddhism is equal to the word, is synonymous to the word consciousness straight away. Second, that is what Buddha deals with. That is the essence of what Buddha deals with, is the mind, the workings of the mind. So then we need to know what he means by that, if that's the case, you know. So this is the first point about the mind. In the same way, you could argue in the same way that the Christians and the Jews and the Muslims and indeed the Hindus will talk about this soul or spirit or Atman as necessarily something not physical, which is why materialists don't talk about it. You know, the scientific materialist world would reject the idea of something not physical because you can't see it through a microscope. I mean, whatever. As we know in our modern world, where we talk, it's what we can see and taste and touch and smell, even through a microscope. You know, that's what we're dealing with in this, what we call the scientific world, the materialist, the philosophical materialist world. But for the Buddha, his view of what the mind is has aspects, if you like, put it this way, has aspects of what the world calls spirit or soul, something more subtle. So the word mind in Buddhism, like I said, refers to, is used synonymously with the word consciousness. So it refers to the first point, fundamental point for the Buddha. The whole of Buddhist view, because Buddhism essentially is a world view, which might be surprising to us, because it's not just psychology. There's Buddhist epistemology, there's Buddhist psychology, there's Buddhist, you know, Buddhist philosophy. Basically it's a worldview. And this certainly is what is studied in the Tibetan monastic university system, and indeed in other Buddhist countries as well, not everywhere necessarily. So it's a worldview, you know. It's a view of the universe, Buddha's observations of the way the world functions. What is a sentient being? What is happiness? What is suffering? And specifically, what is the mind and its role? So the role of the mind in Buddhism is absolutely central to the entire universe. You know, so if that's the case, we had better know what he means by it. I mean, we all say the word mind, but depending on our perspective, we're going to be thinking it refers to different things. So for the Buddha, it indeed does refer to what, you know, to conceptuality, to all our thoughts. Definitely does that. But he is not referring to the brain. So this is the point, that if we can prove Buddha is wrong, the whole of Buddhism would really collapse into a heap of absurdity. For the Buddha, it's fundamental that the mind is not physical. So the Christians and the Muslims and the Jews will say the soul is not physical. This is one aspect of it, which is a gift from God. There's no concept like that in Buddhism. So the first point in Buddhism, one of the fundamental differences, mind or consciousness is not physical. But equally, there's no creator in Buddhism. So straight away, when people hear that, well, then it's not spiritual, is it? Not religious, is it? Because we think by definition, religion equals creator. Again, not for the Buddha. So his word mind or consciousness, it does refer to all your thoughts. Positive thoughts, love and, you know, emotions, love and compassion, your crazy thoughts, anger and jealousy and violence, your psychosis, your schizophrenia, whatever you want to call it, that is all mind in Buddhism. They're all parts of the mind, and it is not physical. So this blows our mind if we hear this, because what are you talking about? You know, we can talk about certain mental illnesses, and we can look at the dysfunction of the chemicals and the function of the brain here and the genes there, and that's physical. So how are you saying it can be not physical? Well, this is the point. One has to, you know, look into what Buddha's saying. So there is the body and there is the mind. There's no argument body and mind exist. Body does exist, but for the Buddha, that is not the mind. So mind is necessarily not physical. Clearly, it functions intimately and inextricably, you could say, in relation to the body. So, I mean, without, like I always say this, without insulting neuroscientists, you could say that from the Buddhist perspective, what goes on in the brain is merely not trying to insult anybody, it's a physical indicator of what's going on in the mind. That's the way to say it, you know. So then in the more esoteric teachings, they refer to gross mind or gross consciousness. And that refers to our sensory consciousness, our capacity to cognize things through the eye consciousness, through the ear consciousness, through the taste consciousness, through the touch consciousness, through the smell consciousness, the nose consciousness. But the word here, consciousness, is referring to a non-physical part of us, working hand in hand with the eyeball, the ear, the nerves, the skin, blah, blah, blah. This is the way to talk about it. So the fundamental point in Buddhism, and again, I say seriously, the whole of Buddhist worldview, all of Buddhist philosophy, all of Buddhist psychology would collapse into a heap of incoherent nonsense if we can prove that Buddha's wrong in asserting that mind is not physical. So clearly you can't prove it immediately. It takes time. In fact, highly advanced practice is what eventually enables you to see the truth of this. So clearly from the beginning, one takes it as your working hypothesis. This is any position of any thinker, any scientist, isn't it? But I'm just discussing what the Buddha's view would say. So it's not physical. So it refers to the grosser level, to all your thought, to the sensory consciousness. Then we have the subtler level of consciousness, and that indeed is our feelings, what we call feelings and emotions. But this also includes all the aspects of our mental consciousness, all our thoughts. Now that can include scientific thoughts, thoughts about music, highly sophisticated theories about mathematics. They're all actually concepts, aren't they? So that's mind. So the conceptual level, the thinking level, either the intelligent level or the unintelligent thinking level, which we would refer to as emotions. The negative emotions like anger and jealousy and low self-esteem and rage and despair, these emotions that we refer to, for the Buddha, they are all expressions of our mind. The body clearly is intimately involved. You see a person who's feeling anger, that's the mind. But look at the body. They're shouting, they're yelling, tears are coming out the eyes. It's clear that body and mind are inextricably linked, you know. So this is your mental consciousness, and it's got these very grosser levels that we experience in day to day. And then even the grosser level of the sensory consciousness. But the real work, as Lama Zopa puts it, the workshop is in the mind. And this is the real work of being a Buddhist, as Lama Yeshe puts it, of being your own therapist. So this is where meditation comes in. Now, before we finish that, we've even got this is the crucial point that's radically different from the materialist scientific views. We've got a much subtler level of consciousness or mind that is not a function of the brain and can't therefore be observed with microscopes. So this is what's interesting about the Dalai Lama these last 30, 40 more years. He's marvelous in his wish to reach out to other thinkers. So he's well known in the world of psychology and science and philosophy and religion in wanting to communicate, wanting to share ideas and find common ground. And he's brilliant at that. And as a result of that, the last 30, 40 years, there have been this amazing series of conferences, first initiated by a group with His Holiness, and now many others as a result. And in many major universities are all putting a lot of investment into this type of, into this relationship between the brain, neuroscience, and the Buddhist view of the mind, which is absolutely marvelous, right? It's marvelous that this is happening. And so what that's also bringing is a willingness on the part of modern thinkers, and usually that means us, stemming from Europe, isn't it? The scientific teachings coming, the psychological teachings of Freud and Jung, and the scientific teachings coming from all the great thinkers, tracking back to to Galileo and that mob. We're a little bit arrogant. We think we began the universe. We think we understood the universe for the first time. We think we began the investigation into the nature of self probably 100 years ago with Mr. Freud. But as I always like to quote the Dalai Lama, he was the one, he said it was these Indians more than 3,000 years ago who were the ones who began the investigation into the nature of self. And this is a big surprise to us in the modern world, but we're beginning to see this and see the extraordinary literature that's existing, that is now more and more coming into English, and other languages, and being practiced and studied by modern people. So it's a real eye-opener for our world, So anyway, the Buddhist view of the mind, it's not physical. The crucial point, and this is a shock, it is not the handiwork either of a creator. In Buddhism, there is no concept of creator. That's where he was a major point where he diverged from all the Hindu tradition. There's no kind of fundamental source. There's no teaching like that in Buddhism. There are teachings about cause and effect, and that's the crucial one, but there's no first cause. I know in the Christian teachings, there are huge teachings in the Christian teachings about how there can be a thing called a first cause. I mean, capital F, capital C, it's a big deal. The Buddha would absolutely argue with that. It's not viable. So we're not the handiwork of a creator, but so shockingly, our mind, our thoughts and feelings and emotions, unconscious, subconscious, because this is what mind refers to, the grosser level, the sensory, the subtle level, and the very subtle level that is not evident through a microscope. This is the unique point about the Buddhist psychological model that has been discovered by these Indians 3,000 years ago, that we have not discovered yet in modern world, but which people are looking into finally, this very subtle level of consciousness that as I said, we don't even posit this level. And so all of this part of this mind is not physical and is not the handiwork of a creator, no concept. I have to sneeze, excuse me. I thought I'd given up sneezing by leaving Santa Fe, but I haven't. It followed me to New York. Hang on a minute. And the other one is even more shocking, because mind is not physical, or mind not physical, it is not the handiwork of our parents. This is a shattering concept. I mean, this is a shattering concept, because we have to see, I think, that obviously if we posit only the brain, if we posit only the physical, which is what the materialist philosophical and psychological view, scientific view necessarily does, although people are looking into these other things, then it's very shocking to say that your mind, your love, your hate, your being good at music or football, your psychosis or your compassion or your intelligence are not coming from your parents. This is so shocking. It's like you're speechless if you hear that, because all of our scientific models and all of our psychological models are absolutely rooted in the view that we are made by mummy and daddy. But the Buddha says, no, you're not. This is a very shocking concept, a hugely shocking concept, that if you're interested in Buddhism, it demands you think this through. You can't just be superficial about it. And the key point here, the implication of this is really, for me, one of the major things that I love about the Buddhist teachings. I mean, I'm a Buddhist, I've obviously chosen that, is that when you realize the Buddhist view that you, in other words, you can't blame your mother for being good at music. You can't blame your mother, you know, for being a psychopath. You can't blame your mother, or because this is the real point that's very different from the Buddhist view, both the Christians and the materialists, is that your consciousness, not the handiwork of mummy and daddy, not the handiwork of a creator, but it's the handiwork of your own past. Your consciousness came from before. It's not okay. Sweetie pie, I'm just in the middle of a little teaching, so I'm going to have to call you back. Goodbye, darling. That was my little sister, who's actually not little really, but she's my little sister, but she's 70. We're all old, you see now. And she's been sick, so I wanted to let her know that I'm here. So I just had to say hello. Okay, excuse me. I have to keep remembering I've only got 5 sisters left. I had 6 before. I have to keep remembering there are 5 sisters left. Janet died. Okay, that was Polly. She's the youngest of the girls. And then my brother came last. My brother came the 7th, and I'll remember the day he was born. I tell you, it was 7:15 on a Sunday evening, 1953. I would have been 9, and we got the call from the hospital. I remember my father was there, because in those days, daddies didn't go to the hospital. I remember he's so excited. He finally had a son. He had 7 daughters before that, and he ran down the length of. I'm sure I always imagine him running down the length of the main road, Murrumbina Road, cheering. Of course, he didn't probably, but he was born in the middle of this radio. You know, back in those days, we didn't have television, right? In Australia, it didn't come until 1956. So that we used to have radios. You know, my grandmother listened to all the radio shows, you know, all the romantic ones, and there was one called Dad and Dave, which is hilarious, ridiculous, really Australian, ridiculous program called Dad and Dave. Well, my brother was born during that time. So that's a piece of my family history. Back to the mind. Okay. So your mind is not physical. It has much subtler levels. It refers to the grosser levels. It refers to the negative. It refers to the positive. It works in conjunction with the brain, but not the subtler levels. If you were to see a person who has this technique that these genius Indians invented 3,000 years ago, and which the Buddha took with him 500 years later when he diverged in his own direction, in particular in relation to his own direct experiential findings about the nature of self. If you were to see a person in this state of samadhi, as they call it, which is this very subtle level of mind, they would look like they were dead, because you can't see the evidence of it. So in other words, mind is not physical in Buddhism. There's grosser level, subtle level, the negative, the positive. So in other words, it's the word that refers to all your feelings and emotions and unconscious and subconscious and negative and positive, the works. And then it works in conjunction with your body at the grosser level, certainly. So that's the general idea of what the mind is. But like I said before, the key point for the Buddha, if we're not the handiwork of a mummy and daddy, which is the materialist view, and even if you're a Christian, you believe your mother and father gave you the body. We know that. And they did. In fact, Buddha would agree too. It's obvious they gave you a body. You can't argue with that one. There's the sperm and egg, and it grows into your body. That's clear. But they don't give you a mind. They don't give you anger. You can't blame Hitler's mum, in other words. You know, she's this poor mum who had some karma with this bloke, and she gives birth to this wacko, you know. You can't blame Hitler's this little Austrian housewife. You can't blame the mother for Mozart. I mean, she wasn't that clever at music. So so of course, I just say that like a joke, but it's literally the point for the Buddhist one. So the key point for the Buddhist one is, if you're not made by your mummy and daddy, and if you're not made by a creator, and in both cases, the one thing they both agree on, those two fundamentally different views, the religious views of creator and the materialist views, they both agree that you began in your mother's womb. You began in your mother's womb. Now, the Christians and Jews I have different views. I've heard the Jews say that God doesn't put a soul there until a few months after the fetus has begun. The Christians would say your soul begins at the time of the egg and sperm, blah, blah, blah. So different views, right? But the Buddha's view is very clear. Your consciousness does not come from a creator. It does not come from mummy and daddy. It is not a function of the brain. It's its own continuity. So they even have the term mental continuum. So this is background, by the way, for Muriel's question. This is not even we haven't even begun to answer a question yet. We've got to know what the mind is first, Muriel. Then we can talk about how to work with it, which is the question. So the role of the mind in Buddhism is yeah, no, I can see Bade Uzgil is there for a while, but I'm going to be another good 10 minutes before I let you go and ask a question. But keep your hand up. I've got to finish my little story, then we can have questions. So, okay, the point in Buddhism, which is the one that's the experiential implication of which I find most powerful, is that your consciousness doesn't come from nowhere. It's a product. It's its own continuity. They have a term called mental continuum. And clearly, as you can see, if you're in that, Buddha would say your mind comes from before where? Your mind. It's a river of mental moments, and you can track it back. You can track it back from today. And if you had perfect memory, you can track it back in an unbroken chain of mental moments, right back to the second of conception. You'd have to find an unbroken chain of mental moments, wouldn't you? 99.9% of us can't remember all of it, but we can deduce that. It's not as if you go to sleep one night and your mind disappears and it comes back again. It's an unbroken chain of mental moments. Think of it like that. So when you get to the second of conception, then you got to say, well, what about the moment before conception? Where was I then? Well, if you're a Christian, you were with God. God hadn't made you yet. And if you're a mummy and daddy, they hadn't made you yet. So there's no you before that moment. But for the Buddha, there is. Your consciousness came from before, and not more than a few weeks before that, it was in a previous body. And then a few weeks before that life, it was in a previous body. And a few weeks before that life, and so on and so forth and so on and so forth. This is the Buddhist observation. This is the view in Buddhism, that your consciousness goes back and back and back and will continue further, further, further. And the other crucial piece, which is now we're getting into answering Muriel's question, or David's wish to discuss with Muriel, mind training. Why is that important? Because the Buddha is basically saying, and quoting His Holiness, that we are our own creators. Now, that's pretty much a big shock. We thought mummy and daddy creators, and we thought God creators. Well, neither, Buddha says. You create yourself, honey, Buddha says. But in this kind of, not like in a magic wand, boom, you're created, but you're the product of your own past. Now, in the materialist view, we definitely posit a past, but that past consists of mummy, daddy, grandma, grandpa, and back to the monkeys, doesn't it? And indeed, for your body, yes, you could argue that, but not for your mind. Your mind does not come from your grandmother or your father or your mother. This is the shocking bit, and it takes a while to hear this. And if you wish to be a Buddhist, then you take this on board as your hypothesis, don't you? So then your consciousness tracks it back to itself. In other words, if you get back to the first moment of conception, and you go to the second before, where was the egg? Well, we know it was in mummy's body. Where was the sperm? We know it was in daddy's body. But where was your mind? It was a previous moment of itself, clearly at a subtle level. And before, a few weeks before that, and they've detailed in the Buddhist literature, it was in a previous body, and so on. Now, the thing is, the point about this is the law, and this is for the Buddha, the point, the natural law, as far as he's concerned, that runs this mind. The natural law within which this mind runs, put it that way, is the law of karma. And for the Buddha, because he's not a creator, he doesn't posit such a concept. In fact, we don't need creating. He says we do fine creating our own mess, and we can do fine creating our own happiness and indeed enlightenment. We are the boss. I'm sure this is why I love Buddhism, because I love being the boss. So basically what that means is the law of karma. The simplest point about that is that Buddha's view is every millisecond of what any person, any mind possessor, the lovely term in Tibetan that we translate in English, sentient being, every mind possessor, they say in Tibetan, semchen, and that includes humans, ants, dogs, monkeys, bugs, and many other types of beings whom we cannot cognize with our mind, because they've got subtler levels of physicality, and haven't got the grosser level of physicality that we have. There are trillions more of these semchens, mind possessors. And the Buddha's view is, his observation, this is not what he made up, he does not create things. This is a major difference in the Buddhist religious views. There's no concept of a creator, no concept. He argues with it. And he says that basically every millisecond of what any sentient being thinks, does, says, programs that mind in those very actions, thoughts, and words. And that's the process that produces the person we become, moment by moment, year after year, and life after life. So we literally, best way to put it, as Dalai Lama says, we create ourselves. Now, this takes time to even get intellectually, because ego's view is very powerful, that we even say it, I didn't ask to get born, it's not my fault. And the way ego functions, we see this, is we act as if we are these innocent victims that got plonked on this planet. You know, if we've got faith in God, that's okay. We don't blame God. But if you've got doubts about God, you know, you're going to blame God. What's he plonking me on the planet for and giving me all this suffering? I mean, I remember a marvelous documentary about you know, Auschwitz and all the rest. And of course, the struggle for these poor people who suffered so terribly. One woman said I gave up God. I could not find a way to understand God. Then later, she said, as she got old, she came to terms with God. You know, she managed to find a way to understand it. That's a really good point. So, you know, naturally you'd blame. There's an instinctive ego, we see it, where you blame, you know, it's blame. I didn't ask to get born, it's not my fault. We say words like that. Well, that for the Buddha is a function of ego. It's exactly how it is. This dualistic view that feels like I'm this innocent victim who got plonked on this planet to whom things happen fairly and unfairly. Bad things and good things, good luck and bad luck. We want the good luck and we don't want the bad luck. But there's no logic to any of us for us. I mean, no wonder we live in fear and misery. Well, Buddha says there is logic to it all, and it's called the law of karma. And we are the product. Like we say in the materialist view, we are the product of our past, but not mummies and daddies, not grandmas and grandpas, not the monkeys. We are the product of our own past. That's a big ask. That's a big point in the world. You know, this is massive. So in other words, reincarnation is fundamental to the entire Buddhist view about how the mind exists and what it is and how it functions and what produces the person we become, what produced the person I am now and what produces my future person. So that's where, like I said, when I didn't say now, but when I first heard these teachings, remember, I didn't understand it as well as I couldn't say it like this now, then, but I remember the view of karma, that somehow you produce yourself. I found that a piece that had been missing in my life. I liked that a lot. I didn't feel it as bad. You know, I thought it was good. In other words, we are responsible for all the good things that happen to us, and we are responsible for all the bad things that happen. Now, that's a problem for us because we freak out when we hear that. So it takes a lot of thinking about. So now the question, then, what's the reason to work on the mind? Why is the mind, you know, Buddha's expertise? Why would there be expertise about the mind? I mean, so what? Who cares, you know? Why is because if you produce yourself, if whatever you think and do and say produces who you become, and you know that your mind does the work, your mind, you know, your body and your speech are like the servants of your mind. Your body and your speech carry out the wishes of your mind. So you better learn to know your mind because that's the boss. So then being your own therapist, as Lama, she puts it, that's what being a Buddhist is. And there are these detailed descriptions of the way the mind works, how it functions exactly. And then these meditation techniques that enable you to become super familiar with your mind so that you can learn to be in charge of yourself. That's it. That's the essence of it. So that's the answer, Muriel. Now we can now start to look at the way, how you look at the mind and what is, so the thing behind that is then why you want to work on your mind is because guess what, folks? Guess what, honey? Buddha says, we all want to be happy and we don't want suffering. So one way of framing the entirety of Buddhist psychology and Buddhist view of the world is the methodology for how to learn to identify in your mind the states of mind and then the actions that follow that cause you suffering, because it's cause and effect, and the states of mind and the actions you do on the basis of that will produce you happiness. So given that you want happiness and don't want suffering, that's the learning. You learn to identify in your mind and you learn to change your mind. And really, Buddha's like a cognitive therapist. You learn to become intimately familiar with your mind so you can learn to change it. And change what to what? Change the unhappy, negative, neurotic voices of ego, because they're the source of your pain and the source of why you harm others, to lessen and eventually eliminate those, and to grow and grow the positive parts of your mind, which are the source of your own happiness and the source of why you can be of benefit to others. That's the bottom line. So now, Bade or Bade, whoever you are, my dear, why don't you talk to me? Speak up.
Hello,
we-
Venerable,
How do I
Venerable
say your name?
Robina.
How do I
Bade.
say your name? Bade, I thought so. You talk to us, Bade.
Yeah, so I was just thinking, I like how you put it, that if the brain is completely responsible for the mind in, all aspects, then, we're studying a bunch of nonsense. And so I'd like to point out that if indeed that were the case, and consciousness is purely a result of the physical brain, then I think that our consciousness would not be able to affect the physical brain. But I think without even talking about neuroscientific findings in that field, I did a little experiment when Geshe-la gave his bodhicitta retreat. I've been taking.
Which Geshe was that? Which Geshe was that?
Sherab.
Sorry. Okay, good, very good. Well, go on.
Yes, and so I had some medications, psychiatric, and I have to preface this by saying that I strongly believe that medications are very helpful, but I personally took an experiment, and
Yes.
I stopped the medications for the week of, near that retreat and after following teachings, and I had zero withdrawal effects. I did not need them.
There you go.
So, I mean, I think that, so I feel like that is kind of my own personal experience of the mind affecting the brain chemically.
That's it, exactly. And yeah, absolutely. And there's so much, there's already, already now, what do they call it? Neuroplasticity. I remember there's one Canadian scientist like 30 years ago or something saying that it was the greatest finding of the 20th century, that actually what goes on in our thoughts impacts upon the brain, that the brain, we're not stuck with the brain we're born with. So it's marvelous that we're finding this, isn't it, Buddy? It's perfect.
Yes, we're learning
and
so
all
much. Yes,
even these experiments. I remember one lot of experiments done on the brain. Oh, excuse me, hang on. On the brain of that French monk, Mathieu Ricard. Just all he was doing, nothing esoteric. He was doing meditations, simply thinking about compassion and how it impacted on his brain. So it's really encouraging to hear this, isn't it? So by working on the brain, you can change your mind, and by working on your mind, you can change your brain. It's really encouraging, isn't it? So that's a great point, but thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
Thank you, sweetheart. So yes, then now, Dana, talk to me. Dana, talk to me.
Hi, Venerable Robina.
Hi.
I'm so glad to be here today. My question is, it kind of popped in my head as you were talking about it, the mental continuum, and is that, I'm just curious what Buddhist thoughts are on, as that goes back to the origins of humanity, say, like my mental continuum at some point, I kind of get the idea of dependent origination, but is there a beginning?
No, that's a really good question. And it's a hugely powerful question, because the Buddha would say, if you can go back to and come back to a first moment, then that is an impossibility if you posit the law of cause and effect. That's why the Christians put a lot of discussion into the fact that there can be a first cause, which of course is what they call a creator. That the creator by definition doesn't have a cause. So the Buddha would describe that as not possible, that cause and effect and dependent arising are the fundamental laws that run everything. And from that perspective, you cannot possibly have a first moment of anything. And that includes universes and minds, which of course brings us to the wackiest illusion that time and minds and universes are literally beginningless. And that's the wackiest idea we've ever heard, because we instinctively, desperately all believe in and want a first cause. As His Holiness said one time in one of his discussions with all the scientists about the first Big Bang, he said, Big Bang, no problem, just not the first Big Bang, that's all. So I think even that, and Buddha would in his analysis of dependent arising and emptiness, and the whole view of dualism, that this concept of instinctively wanting and believing in a first moment. We say, when did it begin? When's the first this? It's deeply, he says that's a fundamental mistake. The question itself implies a misconception of causelessness, which is not a possibility. So it's a massive point, actually. So as nutty as it sounds, because instinctively it's shocking to us to think our mind is beginningless. I mean, we don't remember 99% of today. Forget about this life, forget about even one other life, but to say beginningless is hilarious, you know? And then to imagine lives that exist that are beyond even the planet, that are not coming from being human. So there's a lot of assumptions in this that are very, very, very different from the scientific views, you know, and the Christian views. Yeah? Thank you, darling.
Thank you so much.
Susie. Yes, Susie, what's your question, darling? You're up a bit late, sweetie pie. In now 12:30 p.m. midnight. Talk to me. You got hair. You've grown your hair. Or you're wearing a wig. It's your hair, is it?
Can you hear
Susie,
me?
I
Venerable,
want
can
to
you
see
hear
you
me?
as well. And see you. With hair.
Oh, good, good, good. Okay, good.
Good.
Thank you for the
Go on.
teachings. If I wrote down just what you said then about the body and the mind are inextricably linked. So
Yeah.
my question is, can we access the mind? Can we do it the other way around? Can we, I know that the mind is the most important and that's where all the workshop is, but can we access the mind through movement, through the body? Can we do it that way around?
Okay, darling. So, okay, the body and the mind are interdependent. So first of all, we've got the grosser level, which is the grosser level of consciousness is our sensory consciousness, right? Literally just the senses. And that obviously is inextricably linked to the gross body. You can't, so think of it this way. You've got an eyeball, right? And that's the nerves, and you've got an eyeball and the eyelid, and the light is on, all the conditions are there. But the Buddhist view is there has to be eye consciousness, which is that part of your mind that isn't physical, that enables the that works together with the eyeball for you to have a cognition of color and things, right? So that's that one. So that the body is just the body, and it is linked to the sensory consciousness, which is tactile consciousness, nose consciousness, eye consciousness, ear consciousness, taste consciousness. Now that's gross consciousness, and that's the gross physical. Now we know we have feelings, we have emotions, we have love and compassion and anger and joy and all of these things, which we and they go to much subtler levels. They are really in their nature much more subtle, but we experience them, don't we, through the physical. We do that, definitely experience them through the physical, but it's just the tip of the iceberg. So so can we learn to know about our mind by getting in touch with our body? Yes, you can, but only at the grosser level, because necessarily if you've got samadhi through that meditation technique, you'd look like you were dead. Your gross consciousness will literally have ceased. And of course, you're in touch with a subtler level of your mental consciousness, which doesn't depend upon the brain. So it shows how there are these much subtler levels, but we live, most of us, at the grosser level. Most of us won't get samadhi in this life. So we live at the very gross level, and we experience our feelings and our emotions. So now, next point, our problem with being so addicted to our bodies, and don't try to hear me as a negative way, but in a negative way, we make the body the boss, as Lama Yeshe puts it. And that means the moment we have a slight pain in the knee, we freak out. The moment we have a pleasing feeling, when you look at a rainbow and it triggers a pleasant feeling, we get all excited. So we're very susceptible, aren't we, to the experiences of the body, to the sensory experiences. In fact, they do dominate our lives. We can see that. So that's for the Buddha, that's giving so much more power to the body than it is appropriate. In other words, what's going on when you see a rainbow, right? We know it triggers some kind of feeling, but the millisecond your eye consciousness merely sees that shape and color, only because you're familiar with seeing rainbows, and your mental consciousness is then accessed that millisecond next, and then you have a nice story about the rainbow, and then that triggers pleasant feelings. So in other words, so maybe when you were 3 years old, you had some terrible trauma while you were looking at a rainbow, you would not have those pleasant feelings. You'd have an unpleasant feeling because it reminds you of an unpleasant thing. So really the senses are very limited. But it's because our mental, see, this is now the next level, because we've got the next level of mental consciousness. You've heard this often enough. This is not how we talk in the modern world. You go to your, the Tibetan medical system is based on this. You've got the gross level, which is your body and the senses. Then we have our thoughts and feelings and emotions, which are actually more subtle, but we experience them physically at a very gross level. So now the second level of our being is the mental consciousness, and that is more subtle, and that's inextricably linked to this subtler level of physicality, which is these 72,000 subtle channels. It's similar to the Chinese system. It's similar to the Ayurvedic system. It's the Tibetan medical system. You've got this subtle nervous system that's not visible through a microscope, and it's these channels throughout your entire body. And the subtle wind energy or prana, and this view has been around for thousands of years, including in the Western world. This subtle wind energy goes through all those channels, and this is the Buddhist view now. All your mental states, love, compassion, anger, jealousy, they are connected to these wind energies. So your Tibetan doctor, when she feels your pulses, she'll feel there's an imbalance of those winds. She feels it, and she knows that's linked to your attachment, and that's why you've got anxiety. She knows this one's linked to your anger, and that's why you're having these volatile fits, So that's a very detailed description of your subtle mind, which is your mental states linked to the subtle physical. So there is an intimate relationship. And if you're really aware at that subtle level, you're very sophisticated, and you can even work with the subtle physical energies. But we still experience our mental states through our body. And many people, and that is and Buddha's one of his first methods of meditating. They call it, there's a type of meditation called vipassana, and there's many, and it means insight. And one of the first ones he taught is because we are connected to our body, he gets us to concentrate on the different sensations in the body, not because the body's so special, because he wants us to get insight into impermanence, how things change. So many people have access to their mind first through the symptoms of your mind expressing themselves physically. So yes, that is a good method, but different people. For example, for me, I've got the slightest interest in that approach. I don't have any it just leaves, it has no benefit to me. I have no interest in that. I prefer to listen to my thoughts and to try to unpack and unravel the thoughts. We all must do that eventually. But yes, for sure, by noticing what's happening in your body, because your body completely is a victim of your mind. If you're tense and anxious, of course your body experiences it. So some people, depending on their approach to life, can learn to know about their anxiety by checking the muscles and doing those kinds of meditations, for sure. But eventually, Susie, the body is a grosser level. We think of it as, we think emotion. So now look, let's look at emotions. This is our big problem when we're so addicted to the body. So in other words, the only time now that we notice our feelings is when the body expresses it. That's the limiting part of it. So it is a good method, but eventually you've got to get to way more subtle and beyond the body. You've got to get to the level of the actual mental states themselves, which is way more subtle. And our tragedy in our culture, because we're so addicted, this is the downside. There's a good side, like I said before, but the downside is we don't notice we're depressed until you can't move out of bed. We don't notice you're angry until the words are vomiting out your mouth. We don't notice what we're thinking in our mind until our body expresses it. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. But we can use that by working on the body in order to know what's going on in our mind. Some people find that very helpful. You with me? And yes, it can be marvelous way to train people, to help people. I mean, dance and all the many marvelous ways we can use body work with a compassionate motivation to help people. And there's no question about that, Susie. There's no doubt about that. But you've got to understand the purpose of it, not just to, it's just to learn to unpack any method at all we can use to unpack and unravel finally what's going on in our mind. Go for it, baby, whatever works.
Thank you. Thank you, Venerable. Yes, thank you so much. Thank you.
Everyone's different. Everyone needs, some people really need these techniques. Some people, we have different approaches. You understand? You understand?
Yes. Clear.
Good.
Thank you. Thank you, Venerable.
Yes. Hello, Aaron. Talk to me.
Oh, I was just going to say that, like, even though it's not as refined as like Buddhist psychology, like in philosophy, they use the word embodied cognition for the way the body cognizes things for us.
Tell me about it. That's interesting. Tell me about it.
So embodied cognition, and there's different types of this model. there's what's called the larger embodied cognition program and the simple embodied cognition program, is that we cognize through our environment as well as through our body. And the most common proof of this, often used to disprove parallelism, is like if you look at a bright light, your eye automatically adjusts. You don't actually have to say and cognize the belief that you have to close your eye.
That's right. Yes.
And further, another example is when we have a feeling of someone walking behind us. You have that belief, but it's actually cognized through your body. And we can actually damage these abilities to cognize through various injuries. Whereas if we were purely material, we wouldn't be able to do that.
No, there you go. That's right. So it's generally just as an interesting added comment, the Buddhist view would be that we've got intuition, and intuition is a part of the mind, and it's necessarily a subtle level of your consciousness. It's like the beginnings of what they call in Buddhism clairvoyance, which is only what you access when you've got very subtle samadhi. But when you're just more sensitive, in other words, if you're really gross in your own self and really stuck in your own self, you can't reach past your own nose. But having an intuition of someone's feelings, an intuition of danger, that still is your mind, but you feel it at the body level because we live in the body. So I think we feel things, we express things in the body level, and it tells us things. You're absolutely right. Exactly. It's very nice. That's good to hear. Thank you, Aaron. Thank you so much. So yes, Naina, talk to me.
Hi, I have a question. If you could speak on anxiety in the mind and why so many of us have an attachment to that constant worry.
Oh, darling, I know it's so utterly normal, isn't it? It's a combination of things, right? But the key one to understand, which always sounds so simplistic initially, because this is not not the way we talk in the modern psychological model, but attachment. Effectively, Buddha's saying this state of mind called attachment is effectively the source of the suffering of all sentient beings, which sounds pretty shocking because it's like a joke to hear that, because we even use the word differently, But what this attachment is multifaceted. It's the primordial energy of attachment is a constant feeling of dissatisfaction. Everybody has it, unless you're a highly advanced person. So depending on how strong that dissatisfaction is. In other words, dissatisfaction second by second is no matter what you've got, no matter what you see, no matter what you hear, no matter what you taste, no matter what you do, there's an immediate assumption that somehow it's not good enough. Somehow it's not enough. We all feel this in one way or another, and some can be very much stronger than others. So the next, you can also say that that's one major function of attachment, depending on how strong it is in the individual person. And then because you don't feel like you've got enough, and when it's really bad, you don't feel that you are enough, then naturally the next level of attachment is you kind of hanker after something. You think, well, what's missing? So then all this anxiety then to try and find the object of the senses or whatever it might be, such that when you get it, it'll stop the dissatisfaction. So this is really working in all of us to one degree or another all the time. So the anxiety is like feeling not enough, and then worrying about if it will happen, or even worrying about bad things, they might happen. What if this happens? What if that happens? Worrying about the past things. And another function of attachment, which is very much the anxiety as well, is when we talk about control freak, we're all control freaks, Buddha says, because we've all got attachment. So one function of attachment is to control, to manipulate things to get what you feel you must get in order to make the dissatisfaction go away. It's really multifaceted, and it goes to quite subtle levels. So then the anxiety is, what if you don't get it? What if I go, but I want an ice cream. I haven't got an ice cream. Then I think, oh my God, maybe the shop is closed. Maybe the traffic will run me over. Maybe it's going to be too dark. Maybe I'll get raped on the way, depending on your mind and your fears. This is all a function of ego. It's multifaceted. There's more to it than this, but it's not an uncommon thing for all of us. And then you add to this, your worry, your family, the world, the war zone here, the rapists there, the terrorists here, and our minds are overwhelmed by all the things that could happen, might happen, will happen. So no wonder, it's amazing to me we're not all completely crazy. What do you think? Did that help at all? Any of those thoughts? Naina, talk to me. Maybe she's fainted.
I definitely feel like with meditation, it's helped to find.
Did you hear what I said though? Did you hear what I said?
Yes.
Did it make sense what I said? Do you recognize any of it? Naina?
Yes, I tend to worry a lot.
But did you hear what I said, darling? Did you
About
hear?
where it was
Did
stemming
you
from.
recognize something? Huh? I'm just trying to give I'm trying to give an expression of how attachment causes us to function.
Yes.
That's
Yes,
all,
that made a
and
lot
this
of
is the Buddhist. So therefore, the job is, so then, okay, so what's the solution to this? Well, part of the anxiety, so worry, so then talk about worry. So just give a simple example how it works for you. Give a simple example, without being too personal, of course. Give a simple example, darling.
Like I've been having a lot of driving anxiety, and I have to drive somewhere tomorrow. And this whole day I've been super anxious about it. Just like, oh, what if I freak out while I'm driving? And just catastrophe.
Oh, okay. Yeah, there you go. Exactly. You're saying it exactly. So that, and everyone, and for someone else, it could be something different, couldn't it? What if, yeah, that's exactly right. So then, okay, so how do you then, in your own way, based on where you're at, what you're doing, what you understand, how do you deal with it? How do you work with it? How do you argue with those assumptions? Because, how do you, in a sense, it's cognitive. So how do you try to argue with those thoughts? Don't be ridiculous. Now, of course you'll know where you're going. Do you try to calm yourself down? How do you deal with it?
I've been doing a lot of avoidance, which isn't the best, but I've also been trying to lean into when I do get anxious, instead of fighting it, I'm trying to make room for it now, which has helped.
Okay. All right. Okay. But so you hear the thoughts, don't you?
Yes.
So part of the thing is to hear the thoughts, but you see, the real one that takes time to come to, we all see that masses of thoughts come flooding into our mind. We have no control over them. And some can be completely ridiculous. Some can be quite reasonable. So one of the key things we have to try to practice is not to ignore the thoughts, not to give them more power than they need, but to sort of like learn to almost to step back and observe them, and then sort of and try and have some sense, well, that's ridiculous, that maybe, and try and give us whether there's any reality to them, because the trouble is, isn't it, Naina, every thought that arises, we tend to believe it's true. This is quite huge, actually. So if a person's rather paranoid, imagining murderers around the corner, and if I go out, I'll get stabbed. I'm not being rude about any of us. We've all got something, but we tend to believe whatever thought pops up. Do you understand that? And
yes.
A powerful practice is not to fight the thoughts. We can argue with them sometimes, like as if sometimes I think of them all my roommates. And sometimes I think of these crazy roommates all saying all these weird ideas about Robina. You just have to learn to listen sometimes and try to you've got other roommates as well, Naina. You've got kindness, you've got intelligence, you've got clarity, you've got wisdom. You've got lots of good parts to Naina, but we sometimes give too much power to these crazy thoughts that pop up about you, basically. So, one time you need merely to argue with, give it a break, girl, perfectly well you'll be okay. You've got to argue with it. In other words, if a friend comes to you and is saying these very words that your mind is saying, you'd argue with them. Don't be ridiculous, Robina. You're not as bad as you think. It's really okay, honey. Have some confidence. You'll be okay. Sort of calm yourself down like you're your own. That's what Lama Yeshe means by be your own therapist. Other times, let's let them be there and don't give them too much power. Other times, consciously say positive thoughts and give them the power, because they are who you really are. There's many approaches, Naina.
Thank you so much.
Was that useful, sweetheart?
Yes, very much so. Thank you.
So, and then think of tomorrow, your kindness, driving somebody somewhere, how kind you are. Pat yourself on the back, you'll do beautifully. And then you think, well, even if I lose the way, so what? I'll stop. I'll look at my Google map. It's okay. It's okay to fail, Naina. We want to be a good girl all the time. That's another major one for all of us, the attachment to being a good girl. Are you hearing that one?
Oh, yeah, that was a big nugget for me. Thank you.
There you go. That's a big one, darling. So we can also just be brave enough to know we're human beings and we might fail, and that's just cool. All right, darling? So give yourself a break, sweetie pie.
Thank you.
Janice, talk to me, darling. Talk to me, Janice.
How do we get to the point to where we can let go of our ego, have a good, healthy ego, but not to the point of feeling like we have these struggles of being right?
I know, darling. It's so, these questions are so simple, but the workings of the crazy mind are so complex. And that's why I rather like the Buddhist approach that divides, on the face of it, it sounds kind of strange, a bit judgmental, divides all the contents of our mind into the positive, reasonable, optimistic, appropriate, self-confident, compassionate thoughts, and the wacky, self-hating, weird, ridiculous, negative thoughts that make us miserable. And sometimes they're the ones that run the show, and we often allow them to run the show. That's what I was just saying before. So it's just it's this gradual process, really, of being our own therapist, learning to have the courage to listen to all the crazy thoughts, try and identify, distinguish between the nutty ones and the positive ones, not judging ourselves so brutally. I mean, we are our own worst enemies, as my mother used to say to me. And the irony of ego is it's the negative voices, the unhappy ones, the low self-esteem ones, the jealous ones, the fearful ones, the lack of self-confident ones. And they seem to be louder than the other ones, But the mind is infinitely flexible. We can mold our mind into any shape we like, as Lamazopa says. So we have to have that confidence and know it's a gradual process. It's a slow, gradual process, Janice. When we know that, then we persevere,
Mhm.
What do you think?
I think that's a good point. To not be so hard on ourselves.
Oh, this is the terrible irony. Every one of us, I think we're the same to one degree or another, and some quite seriously. This is our major problem, Janice. We just, the negative thoughts seem to pop up more spontaneously, so they loom large. So we have to consciously say positive thoughts. You can't just wait for them to come. So that's one approach, is to, when you hear the negative thought, you've got to have some of your kind roommates, your intelligent roommate, your loving roommate, your forgiving roommate, your non-guilty roommate, quietly arguing with the other nonsense. It really is like that. We talk to ourselves all day and night. We've got to make it much more strategic and much more kind, Janice. Really, it's a major part of practice, darling, day by day.
I think that's a good point. And when you're trying to go to sleep at night, turning off your brain so you're not overthinking.
It's very hard. No, I know, darling, exactly. And that's why sometimes you've got to use different tricks. Like, instead of counting sheep, you can say mantra, sort of like, or have a nice, something just to help us calm the mind down. There's lots of techniques we can use. But one of the major ones is, because we know we can't stop the thoughts in day-to-day life, we have to learn to give them less power. I can't stress this enough. But our tragedy is, whenever they come, we assume they're speaking the truth, and we give them too much power. It's very fascinating.
Thank you for that.
Good, Janice. All right, darling. But who else is there? We're nearly time over. 3 minutes to go. You see, it goes so quick. Hour has gone like an instant. Gone like 1 second.
We have
yes.
Keshav, if you'd like to unmute.
Hi, yes. Hello again, Venerable.
Hello, darling. Talk to me.
I first would like to thank you for a quick minute. It seems like when my own intelligence, my own compassion for myself was not able to get through me, your words last week sort of just penetrated every layer of my own existence and pulled me out of a space that I thought I would be stuck in for a really long time. So thank you for that.
I'm so happy with that. It's a total pleasure, sweetheart.
And since last week, I have gotten my pen and paper ready like a student, like I was at Tushita, and went through a couple of your videos.
Yes.
Just a couple of days ago at the Shanti Deva Center, you spoke about how we do not make the effort because we can't be bothered about it. And then you spoke about how that laziness takes shape of procrastination, that I'll do it later, and that I'm too busy, and that consecutively leads to us feeling a huge weight of burden and guilt. And when I heard those words, since a couple of months of being working with myself and my therapist and other things, I had never heard something so clearly define and or reflect what my mind situation was. And in the end, you said that, of course, we can do it. Of course, that there is a way that we can mold our minds in whatever capacity that we can. I would like to know, with effort, procrastination, and this burden and guilt, what would be the baby steps? Because you mentioned to me one step at a time. And now I'm looking at this and I'm like, what is my one step at a time?
Okay, so the one step at a time. So I think this procrastination, putting something off, and we've got to analyze what we put off. We put off what takes an effort. And then what takes an effort is exactly the opposite of what attachment wants. And attachment's a junkie that wants more than anything, more than sex, drugs, rock and roll. Attachment at the most basic level is to be comfortable, and to not be disturbed, not to be comfortable. It's like an inertia. So even if it's just, wake up in the morning, unless we've got a strict timetable, we usually it's common for us to wake up in the morning and kind of go, oh no, and turn over and get 5 more minutes of sleep. I mean, it's not to force ourselves, but to notice, okay, when attachment is working, it gets excited. So if there's a cake there and you're really attached to cake, I promise you will never put off eating the cake. You will run towards the cake, anticipating it and happily eating it. We are all like that. But if there's something that you don't like doing because it takes effort, then we push it away. So just notice when you even meet something that arises aversion, like doing the dishes, like cleaning your house, like things you don't enjoy doing, things that are tiniest tasks because you're not attached to it. See, attachment's the main one. We love doing what we're attached to, and we will make effort. If you really want your chocolate ice cream, you will drive 3 miles to get it. But as soon as you meet something that you're not attached to, the opposite is aversion, and it can be very tiny aversion. So you notice that, and then you catch it, and then you go against it. It's a little tiny practice. So don't put off doing the dishes. Don't put off that small job that's been on your list of to-dos. Sort of practice not putting it off when you catch it. It happens very quickly. Tiny baby jobs, just as an exercise to kind of reprogram your mind, Does that make sense?
Yes.
It's a couple of days, you try it, you practice. Because it's really like in the same way that we talk about programming our brain, absolutely we're programming our tendencies. We're digging these want to dig these new grooves in our mind, and we do it gently and quietly. So like if you've promised yourself you'll do some practice every day or some yoga every day, just stick to it. Do it. Not more than 5 minutes, but don't put it up. Just do it. And that we always feel better when we do it. And the thought I've got, or even if it's like you've made a decision to not eat so much cake, you've made a small decision, I'm not going to eat too much cake, or I'm not going to have too much, whatever it is. When you give in to that, because attachment can't stand not getting what it wants, this is something slightly different now, then we're waiting for the pleasure to come from the cake. But the thing is, when you don't put off that decision and you stick to your guns for your own sake, you feel glad about yourself.
Right.
You feel happy about yourself. You feel delighted because you did it, So we have to remember that, remember the benefits of doing it, because then we get some courage in ourselves, Just tiny little things, step by step, but don't, one step at a time. And then please keep rejoicing in your good qualities. Okay. Good point to finish on. Thank you, sweetheart. Thank you, darling people. Keep moving, never give up, one step at a time. And we keep going deeper and deeper and deeper. And remember this amazing potential we can look forward to. And there's nothing wrong with looking forward to it. You're creating it now, though. You're sowing the seeds, okay? Jangchob semchog rinpoche, ma kie panam ke gyuchig, kie panyampa me payang, gong ne gondu habashog, gewadi nyudodag, lama sange drubgyone, drowa chikyang marupa, dei sala gopasho.